It took only hours for the biggest political story to become a media story, too.
The New York Times editorial board with this headline just publishing a short time ago: to serve his country, President Biden should leave the race.
The New York Times editorial board going so far as to say he should bow out for the good of the country.
Among those now calling for Biden to step aside, the New York Times editorial board,
the most influential newspaper editorial board in the country, possibly even the world. But all this reporting gives tremendous weight to a group of just over a dozen people who don't know any more than you or I do about what will happen in the race or how anything, even the debate, will ultimately affect the election. I've seen this before. It reminds me of the great and powerful Oz. When you hear the term, the New York Times editorial board, you would of course imagine this giant institutional voice. And you could easily think, well, they have so much knowledge. This is what they do all day. They study the things happening in our society. They know politics. We should really listen to them. And here's where things get tricky. I have seen in my own experience that sometimes people who have influential positions in media are out of touch with the political reality on the ground across the country. They start to think that they know more than they really do because they look at this stuff so much. So they speak authoritatively about what must happen, even before they have facts to point to that back up their arguments. Ahead, I'm going to share a story with you about that. It's about the head of another of the most powerful news agencies in the world, who said something that summarized this kind of unintentional hubris. When it comes to media covering what the New York Times editorial board says, I wish that coverage would provide you with necessary context. Say there are those calling for a change in the ticket, and then first name people who might be active in the party and know what's going on the ground. And sure, also say among those expressing this opinion is a group of 14 people who make up something called the New York Times editorial board. Also cite other editorial boards. Ahead, I'm going to tell you about another major city newspaper editorial board in an actual swing state, unlike New York, that argued the exact opposite. But you probably didn't hear about that in the news. And the media at all times should have a level of humility to keep in mind and state the many unknowns. How would a change in the ticket happen exactly? How would it play out in the race? What would various voters think? What would happen to all the money that's been raised? That gets complicated. How would Biden's supporters feel about that change? There are loud voices in the party supporting him and saying, how come Republicans let all of Trump's delusions and trailing off and everything else go, but Democrats can't let Biden recover from this? That exists too. So if you're going to talk about what an editorial board says, then ask them questions. What about all these unknowns? Ahead, I'm going to share with you an adage from a former defense secretary that I think that media should use as a motto. Plus, totally separate note, this is cool. We are welcoming a new sponsor to They Stand Corrected, and it's a sponsor with a media story to tell. The person you'll hear from is the CEO of a company that is in a market that is suddenly experiencing massive growth into the billions. This industry is suddenly all over the news. The chances are you have heard or will hear about this industry really soon. And this CEO that you'll hear from is arguing for regulation. Yep. He is saying, FDA, please regulate our entire industry. You'll hear why. All that coming up here today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs. This is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which is about fact-checking the news and exploring systemic problems that are holding the news back from giving us the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. As I say often on this show, truth requires two things, facts plus context. And if you're not getting both, you're not getting the truth. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. So I have a newsletter that you can sign up for. It's free and it's packed with links of things that I talk about on this show. So you can see it for yourself if you want to. Also, that is a great way to get in touch with me. If you choose to support the show by becoming a paid subscriber, that will allow us to continue existing. Thank you so much to everyone who's doing that. If you are a paid subscriber, then you're able to leave comments in the newsletter itself. For everyone else, there is a form you can find at my website. You'll see links to all this stuff in the show notes and at my site, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. One thing I do is explore the issues that you ask me to. I keep hearing from people all the time asking me to look into various things, and that is a big part of what inspired me to look into this today. Let's start with this. It is not a diss on the New York Times or its editorial board when I tell you that this one group of 14 opinion writers and editors having an opinion should not be the giant story that it is in the rest of the media. They may be very well-meaning opinion writers with interesting takes. They also don't have any ability to predict the future or any magic knowledge of how anything will play out politically. The breathless coverage of this one small group of people gives them so much weight. This was all over the headlines of tons of news agencies, and it was leading newscasts. Here's CNN, for example.
Tonight, the New York Times editorial board with this headline just publishing a short time ago: to serve his country, President Biden should leave the race. We're going to talk more about that editorial board and what they're writing there, what their argument is in a moment.
Now ABC.
Among those now calling for Biden to step aside, the New York Times editorial board
And NBC.
The New York Times editorial board going so far as to say he should bow out for the good of the country.
If you read what they wrote, you'll see that immediately after the debate, they felt strongly about this. They were not pointing to any data or sudden changes in the polling. That stuff hadn't come in yet. It was their immediate feeling that this would be the right move. Okay. And their fear is understandable. As they point out, the threat of a second Trump term is real, and it's filled with dangers for democracy. And that was before the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity, which goes directly against the basic concept that no one is above the law. I actually weighed in on that on social media. I pointed out how telling it is that no one seems to be afraid of what Biden would do with that immunity, but everyone who understands the fight for democracy is terrified of what Trump would do with it. Anyway, here's part of what this group of opinion writers at a newspaper, the New York Times, said in their immediate hot take piece. Quote, "There are Democratic leaders better equipped to present clear, compelling, and energetic alternatives to a second Trump presidency. There's no reason for the party to risk the stability and security of the country by forcing voters to choose between Mr. Trump's deficiencies and those of Mr. Biden. It's too big a bet to simply hope Americans will overlook or discount Mr. Biden's age and infirmity that they see with their own eyes." That's an opinion. You might agree with it. It's important to contextualize this. They did not go into the many, many unknowns of what would happen if someone else was put at the top of the ticket, how voters on the ground would feel, who else could win certain so-called heartland voters, etc. And at the same time that the New York Times was saying this, the Biden team was pointing out other things that also speak to this same reality of the media. Here's something they said at a statement. Here's a quote. "It's a familiar story. Following Thursday night's debate, the Beltway class is counting Joe Biden out. The data in the battleground stage, though, tells a different story. On every metric that matters, data shows it did nothing to change the American people's perception. Our supporters are more fired up than ever, and Donald Trump only reminded voters of why they fired him 4 years ago and failed to expand his appeal beyond his MAGA base." Now, to be fair, news networks did have some folks say this kind of thing in interviews. Here's an example. This is Ashley Allison, a CNN political commentator.
I think the debate was actually more of a couch pusher than a candidate switcher. I don't think people watched that debate and said, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden anymore. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Because for every misstep or misspeaking that Joe Biden had, Donald Trump had a lie to combat it. And so the American public is like, I don't want either of those. So this is actually where the campaigns matter. You're going to actually have to get in communities, get on the phones, get indoors, place your ads, work with groups on the ground to get voters to stay off the couch, to be convinced that Joe Biden can do that job and that Donald Trump is a true threat to our democracy.
At the point that all these conversations were happening, there wasn't yet concrete evidence of how the debate, and actually the coverage of the debate as well, could impact the race in those states. It was all very early. My concern is that the way the New York Times editorial board is presented, the media is fueling an idea that this group of people must really be in the know. Maybe, but maybe not. Sometimes people who have influential positions in the media forget how much they don't know. And I told you at the top that I have a story about this. So here it is. Have you ever had an experience in any job in which you felt that the CEO or another big boss was looking right through you, like so disrespectful that it was as though you didn't even exist? I had that in my early days in the CNN newsroom. It was years ago, and I'm not going to say which year because I was there under lots of different leaders, and I'm not going to say which one. Anyway, I was at a computer in the newsroom working with this small team that put together something called the internal wires. These were the stories that served as a heartbeat of CNN operations. They would go out to all the CNN outlets everywhere as reportable information. The head of the network came over with a group of executives and leaders of shows, and he was giving them directions about upcoming news coverage. He was literally leaning on my computer, but did not look down to acknowledge my existence. This is how I heard everything he said. I actually looked up at him a couple times, but no luck in catching his eyes and didn't want to interrupt him. Anyway, I've never forgotten what he said. He said, "I just got back from Louisiana, and here's what's going to happen in the Senate race there." Now, that sentence itself should set off red flags. You may have been somewhere, but you don't have a crystal ball to see the future. He was specific about who would win and by how much and all that, and he wanted everyone to get ready and organize their coverage plans around it, and they nodded their heads and said they would. A few days later, the race happened, and of course, the results were the exact opposite of what he expected. No shock there. But what's so memorable about this is that it is a mental trap that I have seen other people fall into in newsrooms so many times. You hear lines like this. People say, "Well, I've been there, and therefore I know." Well, no, having been to a place does not give you automatically any more knowledge beyond what you yourself saw and heard. Plus, they often don't even fact check what they were told while they were there. When people immerse themselves in a story like this, they can start to get a false sense that they know more than they do. And sometimes they even think that they can accurately predict how ongoing events are going to affect an election. That can be the case with editorial boards too. People on these boards might feel strongly, but they didn't have hard evidence on their side yet. Now, since then, there have been ripple effects, of course, as more people hear about the debate and more things happen. And maybe the signs will be strong that the initial instinct that this one editorial board had was right. Maybe the people who are saying the opposite will be proven right. We don't know. But all this stuff needs to be contextualized. So instead of just saying the New York Times editorial board says, tell us who they are and what information they're working off of and whether they're offering any new concrete information. Keep bringing it back to facts for the audience. Hot takes are everywhere these days. We don't need news reports to focus on hot takes. We need them to focus more on what's concrete. What do we know? Also, if you're reporting on an editorial board's position, tell your audience when another editorial board disagrees. That didn't happen much after the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a piece saying the exact opposite. Granted, the Inquirer is not as widely read as the New York Times, but unlike New York, Pennsylvania is usually an actual swing state in elections. Their editorial board took the New York Times headline and inverted it. The Times headline was, "To serve his country, President Biden should leave the race." The Inquirer headline was, "To serve his country, Donald Trump should leave the race." They wrote that Biden's debate performance was a disaster, but, quote, "Lost in the hand-wringing was Donald Trump's usual bombastic litany of lies, hyperbole, bigotry, ignorance, and fear-mongering. His performance demonstrated once again that he is a danger to democracy and unfit for office. In fact, the debate about the debate is misplaced. The only person who should withdraw from the race is Trump." Now, you might agree with that. Again, an opinion. To her credit, on MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski did report on what the Inquirer said. Here she is talking about Trump.
The man who on a regular basis makes no sense at all. When he sounds crazy and slurs his words and talks about batteries and sharks, why aren't there calls for Trump to drop out? Where are they? In the Philadelphia Inquirer, their editorial board did take a stand, writing, quote, "To serve his country, Donald Trump should leave the race." Well, there's one. But where are the other editorial heads? Leaders who were so rocked the other night, who see Trump as so unfit that he should leave the race? Where are they? Desensitized? Disinformed? Inured? The fire hose of falsehoods has blinded you to what's right in front of you every day. Come on.
People have very strong opinions in both directions about what the Democratic Party should do, and the story is changing quickly. I am one of the people, by the way, who says I have no idea. I'm really about facts and try to be conscious of what I know and don't know and cannot predict. How would choosing another candidate change everything? There are people who say giving up on Biden would destroy the party. Other people say sticking with him would destroy the party. That is all predictive stuff. I don't know. I would love for the media to do a better job of taking a deep collective breath and emphasizing things like what facts could come in to help people make a decision. Focus on the unknowns, things we need to learn. There's a motto from a former defense secretary that journalists should keep in mind. He didn't intend it as a motto, but I'm saying it should be one now. That's after this. It's share time. Time to share this show. Click to share it with anyone you think might be interested. Anyone and everyone. And if you're busy right now, maybe you're running or driving or cooking. I hear from people all the time doing different things while they listen. I get it. Set a reminder to share it later. Maybe Google or Siri or Alexa can remind you in an hour. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Levs. More than 2 decades ago, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said this.
As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know.
It, of course, became the subject of a lot of jokes, or whatever the 2002 version of a meme was. I'm definitely not saying that we should be looking to Donald Rumsfeld for advice in general. But this is something the media should remember. There's so much that you don't know, that you can't predict. You don't always know, for example, how anything is going to shape the result of a political race. In this case, replacing a candidate on a ballot would be a historic undertaking filled with unknowns, including unknown unknowns, things the media doesn't even know that it doesn't know. So amid all the opinions about what should happen, please, media, some humility about the open questions surrounding how any move could ultimately play out. To be fair, the New York Times editorial board has admitted in the past that it has historically been wrong. They noted that long ago, the board opposed women's suffrage. But there's also something that happened just a couple of years ago that's worth noting because it's such a sign of a disconnect that can sometimes exist between an editorial board and a full understanding of facts. Here's what happened. The New York Times editorial board wrote a piece about freedom of speech, but they got something big wrong in their lead paragraph. I didn't find an audio version of their piece, but here's what I did find. The Economist had a piece explaining what the New York Times editorial board got wrong in that. So here is a clip from The Economist.
In an attempt to defend free speech, the Times wound up coming out against it. Americans are losing hold of a fundamental right as citizens of a free country, the right to speak their minds and voice their opinions in public without fear of being shamed or shunned, the newspaper declared. There is no right in America, of course, to silence one's critics. The Times itself is in the business of shaming and shunning.
That piece from The Economist went on to say that such work is safeguarded by the First Amendment. So the fact that the members of the New York Times editorial board did not catch their own glaring error, that was messed up. The freedom to shame or shun someone for what they say is crucial, actually. And I'm going to give you a side note here because it involves a journalistic experience. I've mentioned in the past that I spent some time in Nuremberg, Germany. It was so interesting. I met so many awesome people. And I met some descendants of Nazis. And their descendants who I met are very much not Nazis. They were wonderful. They told me stories of how after the loss in World War II, it became so shameful for some people to admit that they had been Nazis, that they had been active in the Nazi Party, the horrible things they had done. So shameful that they didn't even tell their own grandchildren later on what they had done during the war. which also had the effect of not indoctrinating their grandchildren into that same thinking because they weren't telling them what they had done and portraying it as some great thing. Shunning and shaming can be helpful. There are people in this country right now who support Islamist terrorist groups, and we should shun and shame them. All right, tangent alert, back to the point. An editorial board doesn't always get facts right. So let's not imbue one with a sense of knowledge or insight that the rest of us lack. The media should consider what they have to say, along with what Americans from all walks of life are saying. But also, when it comes to this whole idea of keeping in mind that there's a lot you don't know, I want to take a minute to praise some people I have worked with as well. In the story I mentioned earlier, this was while I was at CNN, and there was a war underway, and there were journalists who were embedded with U.S. troops. They would sometimes call in and tell me, or other people in the small team that I was working with, what they were seeing and experiencing. So we would hear from them their little piece of the puzzle in what they were seeing on the ground. And it's crucial reporting and brave. Then, at the end of those conversations, some of the really good reporters asked me, now, could you tell me what's going on in the war? Yes, you heard that right. I was safely at headquarters. They were asking me. But I was like, oh, of course, right. You have the presence of mind to remember that all you're seeing is your little piece of it. You know what you don't know, what's going on everywhere else. So I would pass on to them some information we were getting from people embedded with troops elsewhere. See, that way of thinking is necessary at all times. Have an opinion, sure, but establish what you don't know and what you need to find out. I would love for the New York Times editorial board to write about that. Like, yes, we want a new candidate. How would that happen? Here's what we don't know about all of the challenges that can lead to. It's possible that the journalists you have spread out around the country on the ground in the States following both campaigns are seeing things that, when assembled, can start to give you facts and a sense of what's really going on. All right, enough about that for today. Up next, controversy is erupting over a leaf in the coffee family that's being used in lots of products. You'll hear from a CEO who wants the industry to be regulated after this. This is cool. I want to welcome a new sponsor to this show. It's a company called Mit45. The CEO is a guy named Ryan Niddell. He's a business growth specialist and has all these successes under his belt. It's so interesting what he's doing now, and it includes a media angle. It speaks to a problem that I've seen in the media for a long time. When it comes to anything involving science, a lot of journalists kind of freeze up and get scared. They're convinced that it's too complicated, that they can't possibly understand it, so instead they should just quote people with certain titles at certain organizations. And then they might not cast a wide enough net and find some legitimate scientists who have different takes. Science isn't a magic trick. It's a topic you can wrap your mind around just like anything else. That brings us to Mit45. This company sells products that include something called kratom, which is a tree in the coffee family. It's been used in traditional medicine in Southeast Asia for a very long time. And right now, here in the United States, scientists have different opinions about it. And suddenly, it is all over the news. The chances are you will soon see it in headlines or hear about it in local news reports, with city, state, and federal officials weighing in on it. Some areas are trying to ban kratom, and others are lifting bans because of the benefits of it. Ryan Niddell is basically on a mission now to encourage people, including in the media, to get educated about this stuff. And he's actively pushing for government regulation. That's right. The theories that people have about business people always opposing any and all regulations, he disproves that. He argues that the government should regulate products with kratom for health and safety and also for business reasons. See, I told you, it's interesting. He just published a piece about this in Newsweek, an op-ed. I'll include a link to this in the newsletter. The headline says, "My company sells products containing kratom. The government should regulate us." And in that column, he specifically does not backlink to his company, meaning he didn't make it so that someone can see that op-ed and say, hey, I want to buy this company's products, and then click right there to do so. It's just not there. He is pushing for regulation and education and not using that effort to try to get links to his company. In this piece in Newsweek, he talks about the many benefits of kratom, and he cites a recent study from scientists at Johns Hopkins, the University of Florida, and Thomas Jefferson University saying it should be legal and regulated. Anyway, I spoke with Ryan about his experience trying to reach out to the media about this issue.
So I found two things, Josh. I found one that they seem to be afraid because it's almost like there's this connotation that these kratom guys, they all have to be crooked. They're all killing people. They're all hurting people. And it's like, holy cow, I'll invite anybody at any time to our facility. I'll show her audited financials over the past 4 years. I'll show her FDA report. Like, not all of us are trying to hurt people. Some of us just really believe in the scientific basis of evidence of the plant and how it can be beneficial to people. And so some news outlets are just like, what's kratom? We don't care. Other news outlets have been, gosh, it's just too salacious for us right now. It's too controversial. We don't know enough about it. We don't know who to trust and who to have conversations with. I'm like, I get introduced to both sides of this as well.
I've seen that happen in media. There's often so much wariness and an assumption that someone in business can't possibly have information to offer that might help when it comes to something potentially controversial. And you don't have to take a business's claims at face value. You shouldn't. But sometimes people who run businesses have a lot of knowledge, and that makes them worth hearing in the media also. For the record, Ryan doesn't need his current job and says he would leave in a heartbeat if it was clear that these products should not exist. He encourages people to check out a website, kratomresearchinstitute.org. His company does help to fund it, but is hands off. Whatever these researchers find, he says they find, and he's not on the board. Here he is again.
There needs to be the one-stop shop for, here's a new scientific research study that came out that said kratom is not habit forming, it's not addictive. Here's how you read the medical journal. Here's the background on the person. But don't take that as the gospel. Here's the other side of that there was another researcher that said it's the most harmful thing he's ever studied before. And you need to have one place where someone can go and see both perspectives. And when you show them an article that says it's a pro, you simultaneously give them access to the equal and opposite information if they choose to view it.
Because there's so much research going on right now, so many discoveries, scientists are split on this. They are falling on different sides about whether these products do more good than harm, more harm than good, how to make sure people don't misuse these or overuse them or do anything else unhealthy with them. Ryan wants people to learn and get educated before taking any products that contain kratom. I mentioned earlier that this industry is exploding. I've been learning about this. The kratom market is estimated at $1.9 billion now. It's expected to triple by 2030, as something people are discovering. Anyway, thanks so much to Ryan and to Mid45 for supporting They Stand Corrected. I don't have to say this for legal reasons or anything, but I will anyway. Obviously, do not put any substance into your body based on anything you hear me or anyone else say on this show. Talk to your healthcare providers. But of course, since you're listening to They Stand Corrected, you're intelligent and thoughtful and interested in reality. So you already know that. Thank you, Nextiva, the platform powering more than 100,000 businesses and billions of conversations every year. Nextiva integrates all conversation channels and powers personalized experiences at scale throughout the entire customer journey. Say goodbye to siloed apps and say hello to the unified customer conversation solution. Learn more at nextiva.com. A few quick announcements before I go. Now, first, I plan to do relatively few interviews here because it's about fact-checking the news. But I was offered an interview with an Israeli official, and I talked with her about what it's like to have to face such a hostile press in which so many people believe so many lies and are unwilling to unlearn those lies. Be sure to subscribe to the show if you haven't already, so you will see that episode pop up when it comes out. And I'm working on an episode about polls, especially political polls, and all the confusion around them. It's a problem that has been discussed a lot, but not fixed in a way that provides clarity for news consumers like you, like all of us. Send me your questions about that. And finally, this show has something called Founding Members. It's an option for supporting the show, which you'll find at the newsletter. I'll be thanking our founding members on the show and reading messages from them if they wish. So, if you want to hear a message read by me right here, then jump on in as a founding member. You can find that information at the newsletter linked in the show notes or through my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEBS.com. I love hearing from you. I'll talk to you next week.